My name is Ray Lutz. I'm with Citizens Oversight. We are really fortunate to have Doug, is it Liden?
Correct.
Liden. And actually I've never met Doug till tonight, so it's very nice to meet him as well. He is, I understand, the leading expert on this topic, so we're going to be learning all about it. And then we're going to use this as a starting point so that we can then decide what our game plan is going to be to fix it. Okay, and now let's introduce Doug. Come on up and welcome aboard.
Great, thank you.
Please introduce.
All right, well, thank all of you for showing up, and hopefully you can see and hear okay. First off, there's a lot of litigation going on right now, so I am opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the EPA or the federal government for that matter. To get that out of the way. How many of you, it sounds like there's one person who hasn't been to Tijuana, a few people who actually just were in Tijuana today, but how many of you have not been to Tijuana? Anyone else? Okay, so you all know pretty much. There's a massive migration of people coming into Tijuana and coming out of Tijuana, and in fact, Tijuana is growing really, really fast. Somebody told me from the consulate that there are 60 high-rise buildings either in construction or in the process of being permitted in Tijuana. And so it's a great place for food, and it's a great place for a fairly inexpensive rent, at least compared to San Diego, so that's drawing a lot of people southward. I'm going to do an overview. I'm going to switch to a little video of the Tijuana River to give you an idea of how the whole system works. I was giving this talk to a bunch of Congress people a few weeks ago, and I was talking and walking them through everything I was seeing, and they were seeing nothing. Nobody had bothered, no one was bothering to tell me, and I was just glued on. So anyway, embarrassing moments. So the area outlined in red is the Tijuana River watershed, and as you can see, about 2/3 of it is in Mexico, and the last third, and of course the outlet, is in the Tijuana River. But really the effective beginning of the watershed is in the Rodrigues Dam, and this was created in the 1920s as a source of drinking water when Tijuana was really quite small. And this is one of the wastewater treatment plants that was built with funding from the Japanese Bank of International Cooperation, and this is one of the ones that Suez manages. And it discharges about 6 million gallons a day of really highly treated sewage into the wastewater into the Tijuana River. It was actually designed for that water to be reused. So it's a real shame right now that it's not. It's just they had trouble creating the demand for that level of reused wastewater. There's not a lot of agriculture, as you can see when you look, or green areas that really need water. And it's expensive. So this is the main channel of the Tijuana River. It is channelized all the way from the Rodrigues Dam down to the border. And it meets up top here. Can you see the arrow? Oh, good. It's following. This is the Alomar River, and this is bringing water from Tecate and from the Tecate Brewery, for example. So when you drink a Tecate beer, you'll know where that water goes, or at least where it came from. This is, I'm sure most of you heard about the big collapse that happened in 2017, the big spill. It was about 7 million gallons a day of sewage for the amount of time is in debate, at least a month. And this is where it happened. You can see the inundation, the brown, that's actually a big bus station collapsed, and you can see down here where that wastewater, that 7 million gallons actually entered. You can see probably see the outline right here of that sewage. And that goes about 5 miles north to the U.S.-Mexico border.
How did that happen?
That just happened after a big storm event. Really, a lot of the wastewater infrastructure in Tijuana is really aging. And so when storms happen, it brings a lot of debris, it brings large flows, and the old cement pipes just collapse. So it's something that we're working on. We'll get to it in a minute, but we are working on it with Seth to help rehabilitate or replace a lot of those lines with PVC piping. And this looks like the water has disappeared, but really all it's done is enter a very deep channel. And there are flows that are heading towards the U.S.-Mexico border. When this happened, when this particular spill happened, this was right after, as I mentioned, the rainfall event. So flows in the river were about 200 million gallons a day. There's no infrastructure built to manage those stormwater flows. There was never an intention of managing stormwater flows. However, had this happened during dry weather, those flows would be diverted. And this is what the diversion structure looks like. So those flows are diverted right at this point. You can see they just stop. And this is up to about 23 million gallons a day. So typically the average dry weather flows now are pushing up around 18 million gallons a day. Those flows are actually diverted. They flow by gravity to this pump station right here. And then they're pumped to a pump station that you'll see in a little bit. And then, go one more, you can see what efforts have been made. So IBWC has actually built this little berm made of, they just take some soil every few times a year and build this berm to try to keep some of these small renegade flows that go past the pump station and try to keep those, this is literally right at the border, try to keep those on the Mexican side.
What's IBWC?
I'm sorry, the IBWC is the International Boundary and Water Commission. They are under the State Department, and they're the ones, and you'll see in a second, they're the ones that actually operate. They're in charge of boundaries, setting boundaries to the U.S.-Mexico border. They're also in charge of sanitation along the U.S.-Mexico border. So this is where the flow gauge is. This is the only way we know whether there's, besides obviously visually, this is the only data we have to know whether flows are coming across. CEST, the utility in Mexico, will inform IBWC if there's a breakdown, but we rely most heavily on this gauge that occurs right here, and it will tell us about how much flow is coming across. What we don't know, however, is what size flow actually will reach the ocean. This is still about 3.5 miles to the ocean. And so if it's a very small flow, it may register on the gauge, but may infiltrate into the soil before it ever reaches the ocean. So this is, again, during dry weather. You can see it's completely dry. And this was historically or pre-anthropogenically an ephemeral water body, meaning it only had water when it would rain. Question?
Yeah. Who monitors that IBW?
Sorry, those are the flows.
Is that a joint?
So that is it's the International Boundary and Water Commission they're under the State Department, and they have a sister agency that's in Mexico. And so, which is the Mexican section. So it's sort of joint, but it's, these are the people who have to negotiate water treaties and boundaries, so it's not, it's not always a friendly relationship. We like to think they're always working together, but it is joint. And this is, as I mentioned, this is where that water in the river gets pumped to, along with all the sewage that gets collected. About 25 million gallons, or more than that, about 40 million gallons of sewage gets collected, and 25 million gallons gets sent across the border right here into this space right here, which is the International Wastewater Treatment Plant. Probably the only wastewater treatment plant that I know of that actually treats entirely water from another country. And this was built before there was ever any water sewage projects in Tijuana. And so prior to this, all the sewage would just flow into the river, and many of you probably remember that, and flow into Imperial Beach each and every day. So despite what you're hearing now, there actually has been quite a bit of improvement at least from those early days. Sure.
So this treatment plant is on the Mexican
On the U.S. side. This is on the U.S. side. This is the U.S. Sorry, this is the border right here. This is on the U.S. side. This is the Tijuana River right here flowing.
Is this a fairly new treatment plant?
No, it was built in the late 90s. So, yeah, it was just upgraded. Well,
It's not too old.
no, not too old. And it was just upgraded to treat the secondary, what we call secondary, which means in compliance with the Clean Water Act. And then it gets discharged. This water gets discharged along with water that gets treated right next door in a little plant operated by the city of San Diego, and gets discharged about 3.5 miles offshore into the ocean. This is the the Tijuana River Estuary. And this is Dairy Mart Bridge, for those of you who don't know. And you can see where that water, it has a lot of opportunity to infiltrate if it's during dry weather. Obviously, if it's not during dry weather, it's during wet weather, it will flow all the way to the ocean. And this is where it enters the estuary. And this is an estuary of, most of you already know, you saw some volunteers, an estuary of international importance. It supports about 400 species of birds. It's a real ecological jewel for Southern California. It's the last unbisected wetland in Southern California. In other words, it doesn't have a freeway or a train running through it. This is the new Navy SEAL base where half of the Navy SEALs will get trained. And it was, couple $2 billion, I think, investment. So flows in the river not only affect Imperial Beach residents, but can also affect the Navy SEALs. This is one of the major canyons that feed into the estuary. This is called, and you can see not only do you have the main channel of the river, but you have all these little, about 4 small channels that feed into the estuary as well, come across the border. This is what we call Goat Canyon. And this has a system in place that when there are small flows from Goat Canyon, and oftentimes there are, more often than not, because of renegade flows from Tijuana, a lot of people live, very poor people live here. They break into water pipes, for example, and you'll see small renegade flows come across. Well, these actually, during dry weather, they get diverted and sent into the International Wastewater Treatment Plant. So not really affecting water quality at the border, at the ocean, but certainly causing a lot of consternation for U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, because they have to go and inspect all these areas, and this is pretty contaminated water.
Could I ask you?
Sure.
Because I don't know that area. Where's San Isidro?
So this is actually in San Isidro. I'll show you on a map. I'll try to show you on a map. But this is the International Wastewater Treatment Plant is in San Isidro. So the Imperial Beach, I think this is all actually considered San Isidro. Imperial Beach is just a little bit north of that. This is the channel, in green is outlined what we call Goat Canyon, or Los Laureles Canyon. We've actually, EPA has funded a lot of studies in this canyon. You can see, and I'll show you in a little bit, this is where a lot of new development is happening. Invasive development, people coming over, not having a place to live, and hillsides that are just being denuded for housing, for opportunities for places to live. The problem with that is it causes all sorts of erosion. So every time it rains, it causes a huge amount of sediment to come across the border. And in fact, state of California built, you can see down here, built 2 sediment basins to try to capture that sediment so that it wouldn't cause problems in the estuary downstream of that. And that costs the state of California about $2 million a year to maintain, because they have to clean out all that sediment, separate the trash. I'll get to
And those collectors, that's also maintained by IBWC?
Correct. That is correct. Those collectors are maintained by the International Boundary and Water Commission. Correct. Sure.
Does San Isidro have their own mayor?
No.
They're part of the city.
They're part of the city of San Diego.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Glad all you guys are here.
But Imperial Beach does.
Imperial Beach does. This is, so remember we saw that water in the Tijuana River and Alomar River? Well, now this is where it's been pumped up and over that hill. Tijuana on average sits about 300 feet above sea level, and as you can, obviously the estuary is right at sea level. So geographically, it's a very challenging place, because obviously water wants to flow downhill, and it carries a lot of wastewater, sediment, and trash with it. That water from the river has been pumped up and over that hill and now flows by gravity through this open channel. And it follows along with, there's right next to it, along the road I believe, is the sewage that doesn't get treated at the International Treatment Plant. There's additional sewage that gets actually pumped pumped and then sent down to this wastewater treatment plant. Well, this wastewater treatment plant is in pretty bad condition. It's in desperate need of an upgrade. It's just it's a low-tech system, which oftentimes low-tech systems are the best systems, but this one is very overloaded with solids. And so the effluent quality, first of all, it's only operating about half capacity, and the effluent quality coming out is not good. In addition, what I didn't mention is that Mexico, under a treaty obligation, has to take back all of the solids. We treat 25 million gallons a day of wastewater. Mexico has to take back all of the biosolids, or sludge, as you might call it. And that actually gets stored on this facility right here. And this this water then flows a little bit further south and gets discharged along the coast. For those of you who may remember, these are where the Trump Towers were supposed to get built. That's not joking. I'm not making a political statement here, but those did not happen for one reason or another. But this is an area we still like to say where the effluent meets the affluent. Because this actually, all of this water gets discharged directly into the coast. And typically, and I'll show you a recent really interesting model that we paid Scripps to do. But what we really want to know is really what impact does that flow have on the United States? Well, about 90% of the time, it does not. It flows south. Most of the predominant currents are flowing south. However, about 10% of the time, we do see impacts, or we are likely to see impacts from that on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Excuse me.
Sure.
Where it says discharge, is that water clean enough to be discharged?
No.
So who's in charge of all this?
So this is all Mexico is in charge. We don't have any say in that, although we can, and a program I'll talk to you about in a little bit when we get to the solutions, how we can help fix those problems. It's something that Mexico has plans underway to fix. It's been a long issue for them. I'll go back to my PowerPoint now.
So before you go on,
Sure.
that channel that was going down to that older, okay, there was a discharge. Then right before that, there was the treatment plant, older treatment plant. And that channel that brought the water there, where did that actually come from?
So how the water get here?
Yeah.
It just through a. So there's essentially two conveyances. One that is supposed to just take river water, and that actually bypasses this plant. And then there's an underground pipe that carries wastewater that also flows by gravity from the highest. It gets pumped up the hill and then flows by gravity down. That's encased, and that flows to the treatment plant. Now, that's the way it's supposed to work. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes Mexico combines all these flows, and depending on how much energy, how much pumping capacity they have, so it's a little bit messy.
So is this like the sewer of Tijuana goes to this location?
Most of the wastewater in Tijuana goes to this, except for the 25 MGD that we treat on the U.S. side. The remainder of it, and I would say probably about 60%. We treat about 40% of that water. About 60% is treated either at the treatment plants. That Suez, about 10 million gallons, I think, altogether, is treated by these two really well-operated wastewater treatment plants. And the remainder is either not treated or semi-treated at this wastewater treatment plant on the coast.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Why are we only doing 25?
Why are we only doing 25? That was that predates me, but that was set by a treaty minute. At the time, it was the flows between that plant and this plant at the Punta Bandera was supposed to handle all the Tijuana River flows. Now, that said, the outfall was constructed to handle, I think, like over 100 million gallons, peak flows of 200. And in fact, the footprint of the IBWC was built to handle a lot bigger flows. And that has never materialized for one reason or another. It would take another treaty minute. It would take finding funding for the U.S. side. I think Mexico would be very happy to see the U.S. side treating more. It costs the U.S. probably more. That treatment plant I did a back of the envelope calculation once and determined that the international treatment plant costs about 10 times what it costs for Suez to treat the wastewater at those really highly operating treatment plants. So always the case that in Mexico it's going to be cheaper to do something, and the closer you are to obviously to the source, because there is talk underway about trying to treat the river once it's come across, and there's certainly we have studied that, and we'll get into that in a heartbeat. All right, let me go back to I like you guys asking all these questions. This is great.
Could I ask another?
Sure, why not?
Okay, you're from Tijuana, right? Okay, so are there concerned citizens meeting there in the Tijuana area to address these problems?
Hay ciudadanos interesados en este tema en Tijuana que se reúnen. Hay ciudadanos en Tijuana que están interesados en este tema. Sí. Yeah, I'm answering for them, but they absolutely are. There's a lot of interest in this. I see actually a lot more articles in newspapers on the Mexican side about breaks, about raw wastewater than I see on the U.S. side. So we'll get into a little bit of the socioeconomic problems. I mean, it's not.
Well, that's reassuring.
Yeah, it is. This is a big problem for Mexico as well as for the United States.
Because of cancers and different diseases.
I would say one of the big issues is just smells. I mean, odors is really strong, and that affects development. That affects a lot of different things. So, but let's see. So we kind of went over how the system works. Just to tell you one more time. Again, by treaty minute, Mexico is supposed to keep all flows, whether treated or untreated. Even if Mexico were to have the best treatment system in the world, that treaty minute says we don't want those dry weather flows because this is a saltwater marsh. This is not designed to handle freshwater flows 365 days of the year. So ideally, this system and I'll go get this a bit. We calculated about 130, only about 130, depends on whom you ask, but less than half of the year, those flows are being diverted. So Mexico is operating that system over half the year to keep those flows on the Mexican side. And so were it not for their efforts, you would have flows, that flow wants to go by gravity through the mouth of the estuary. So then of course, as we said, during wet weather, all bets are off. The system, this diverter system right here, was only designed to handle 23 million gallons a day. We're starting to bump up against that level because of all this growth happening in Tijuana. And without reuse, we're going to be pretty much at that limit of this ability to handle these dry weather flows. And then, of course, when it rains, all those flows and whatever is in the river enters. So if there's a break, if there's raw sewage, and there's always at least a little bit of raw sewage in the river, that's going to enter into the United States during wet weather.
So I heard on the news the last 6 days they had some kind of big flow. What would that be?
Yeah, so apparently they had some rains, I guess. I'd been in Mexico
Yeah,
City
they had
last
some thunder showers, I
couple
guess.
weeks, so they had some thunder showers. The other really fascinating thing is there's some really interesting microclimates in Tijuana. So we'll see times where there's actually flows coming across because of rains in Tijuana that we haven't seen on the U.S. side. But all it takes is just a little bit of rain. The smallest, you can figure, it's a big watershed that's already, very close to the capacity to be diverted. So it only takes a little bit of rain to overwhelm that system. The other problem is, and we'll get to this in a second, but when you do have rains, you also have heavy sediment, sand, you have garbage coming across, and that really does damage to the pumps. And so what the Mexican section does is they will shut down that pump station. So again, never built to handle wet weather flows. And so that's what happened, and I've even heard today there's still flows that are happening from that event. So this is the checkerboard of landowners, and I find this map really fascinating because, this is state parks, for example. This is the U.S. Navy. This is County of San Diego. This is in yellow is the City of San Diego. You have the federal government here in red of the International Boundary Water Commission, because that's who owns this property. And so it depends. The reason why this is, and then you have the federal government, DHS along here. it's really fascinating because you take, you know, a representative from each of these different areas and you ask them what the main problem is, and they'll probably tell you something different. You know, Imperial Beach, for example, is predominantly concerned about the flows at the ocean. Border Patrol is really interested in these small flows that are coming across in these little culverts because they have to manage that area. And so sediment's a big, big problem for state parks and in the green because they are the ones that own and operate the land that encompasses this Goat Canyon that we talked about. So anyway, yeah.
Well, from what I understand, Mexico has few regulations when it comes to dumping and right? And
Mexico actually has really good regulations in water, in trash management. The challenge is enforcement. Mexico actually has probably their water laws are probably as strict as ours in the United States. The big problem, of course, is the enforcement issue and just the financial issue of trying to manage. I mean, you have, I think I just heard 3.5% growth in Tijuana. These people are coming without lots of money. They're building, you know, land or building on invasive lands. They're not permitted. They don't have trash services. And so what do they do with their trash? They bundle it up and, you know, put it somewhere where they think trash will be collected. And if there's a rainfall event, and dogs will come tearing through it, and then the rainfall event comes and all that stuff gets carried downhill. So it's not really an issue of lack of regulation.
well, I saw a film a few years ago when I was taking a class at City College, and it was about United States companies such as, I'll give it for instance, like Panasonic, would come down to Mexico and open up a plant where there was very few regulations, hire Mexicans, which was very cheap labor, that would have to work ridiculous hours, and they're dealing with so many products with toxins, and then when it would rain, those
Sure.
there would be so much pollution.
Yeah.
And then when they could take their business like to Bangladesh and get even cheaper labor, they would just abandon the building, abandon all the products, and just take off and all of that. So that's where I got
Sure.
that idea about
Yeah,
it.
no, and there's, you know, certainly there are issues with maquilas not abiding by laws and taking advantage of cheap laborers and lacks enforcement. So, but I just because we're running out of time a little bit, let me focus and try to maybe we'll do questions till the end.
We can get
Okay.
through it.
But no, thank you though. It's good that people. So this is the estuary, as I talked about. Really pretty, really beautiful. This is a development, one of many in Tijuana that you see. This happened in the course of a few months. This unregulated development. This was not permitted, and then about 10 years later, this is what you see still, unpaved roads, and you can see there's no drainage here, and so there's no naturally built, no culverts built for carrying stormwater, and so this is what happens. And we see, these gullies that are, and this we've done a lot of research on here, and we've determined actually, after doing all this research of trying to measure out these, what's happening from rainfall, erosion, what's happening from erosion in creeks, what we determined is one of the biggest sources of sediment is broken water pipes. Because once you have a broken water pipe, it will blow out everything down below it. And so that infrastructure is a really critical issue. This is the trash, of course, that comes across. Coca-Cola is responsible for at least 80% of the plastic water bottles coming across. And you can see styrofoam is a big problem as well. Tijuana just implemented a plastic bag ban, and to be honest, they actually are enforcing it. I was shocked to go into a supermarket and not be able to get a plastic bag. So there is progress happening. I know they're looking at doing a single-use ban as well. Tires, a big problem, and as most of you know, many of these tires are actually coming from the United States. It's a phenomenon where you will go to get new tires, and if your tires even have a small amount of tread on, these companies will send it to Mexico. Well, they will get a second life. That's all well and good, but then they end up in helping to stabilize hillsides, for example, and tires like to roll, so they will roll down back to where they started from. This is what Goat Canyon, I just wanted to go to Goat Canyon because this is what it looks like in the wet season. And you can see a lot of the trash coming across, and you see this is this is all that. I mean, you're seeing really hillsides here in terms of you're seeing part of Tijuana coming across the border. And this is Goat Canyon, the sediment basins again during wet weather. Actually, I'll skip that because we're out of time. But the state actually put in these trash booms and have proven to be very, very effective. So there are people who want to sort of copy this idea along the main channel of the river. I think it's certainly worthy of further study. Obviously, it's the main channel of the river is about 30 times the size of this channel, so it would be a much bigger engineering fix. Plus, you'd have to cost state parks $2 million to take that trash and sediment out of the river. So you multiply that by 30 times, and you get into very expensive types of solutions. So again, we even looked at tires once upon a time, and I think it was $1 to dispose of in Tijuana versus $20 to dispose of in the United States. So again, much more cost-effective solutions. This is some modeling we did for Goat Canyon, and that's some of the culverts you see. Really, what we determined here is that these developments obviously need to be better designed to handle stormwater. They also could really benefit from some simple road paving. Typically, we don't say that at EPA. We don't like impervious surfaces, but this is a very unique case and where road paving can help keep some of that soil in the ground. We've actually, EPA has done some monitoring of this sediment that has come across. And one thing we found, two interesting findings, is that the sediment itself, if you measure it as a whole, is not exceeding any hazardous waste levels. But then we actually someone came up with another question and said, well, there's all these plastic pieces. What if we separate that plastic? And so we did that, and what we determined was the plastics actually, the little plastic pieces, really dioxin, PAHs, pesticides really like to adhere to plastic. And so, and why that's important is because State Parks was actually looking at this idea of using that sediment to help replenish sand. It's a great idea because you actually, you have some sand-deprived areas in Imperial Beach, but because of this issue with plastics, probably not such a great idea. And so that leaves the state parks having less alternatives of what to do with it. This was the big spill that happened, and this is what some of those spills look like. This was not that particular spill, but this was a spill we saw just last time we were out in the Tijuana River. So this is not uncommon, and you can tell very easily what is raw sewage and what is not. That is clearly raw sewage. So obviously the proximity to the estuary determines the number of beach closures, but really beach closures are determined much more. So if you look at just the Imperial Beach, for example, there's a really good correlation to the number of days of rainfall versus how many breaks there were in Tijuana. So much more affected by the rainfall because that's when the river flows. So this was the study that we helped pay for with Scripps, and with the question being how much are these flows in the estuary and at Imperial Beach at south of the border affecting the U.S. And so they did a very sophisticated, first they injected dye to help validate a very sophisticated 3D model that uses all sorts of different data. It uses tide data, it uses temperature, it uses currents, it uses salinity, it uses the bathymetry of the ocean. It's probably the most sophisticated model that I think exists. And what we see is that, as we mentioned before, a lot of the times this is the flows from the Tijuana Estuary. This was when that big spill happened in 2017. So clearly having big effects up and down the coast all the way up to Coronado. These are the flows on the right side. You see the flows from Punta Bandera. And as I mentioned, this model only took place over a month. Most of the time those flows move south or off the coast, but there are times, if we play that again, there are times where it does shoot up north and it clings to the coast. And so you do have effects of that discharge into into the U.S. side of the border. You can see that actually visually at times. This was a satellite photo I was able to get hold of, and it was on the specific day that I was getting complaints from people in Tijuana saying we really smell, from Imperial Beach, we really smell bad, we really smell it, and so we actually, this was before we did the model, I found the satellite imagery, and then what we also did, we worked with an NGO in Tijuana, and they actually did samples, happened to do samples on this very day, and saw a very distinct gradient from the point of discharge all the way up to the Imperial Beach, showing high hits of bacteria. So, and then we talked to Scripps, and sure enough, that was a day when they were having a very strong, what we call a south swell, or a northward current. This obviously has got the attention of Congress, and we received letters every day. We actually just received a visit from a bunch of congressionals who were interested in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Congressional delegation went to Mexico City, and then they came to the U.S. because they wanted to see what could be done, and if anything could be done with the U.S.-Mexican-Canada agreement to try to improve this situation in both labor and environmental. This was a great article, positive article. Unfortunately, it was in 1992, but it's basically said the beach fouled by sewage for years reopens. Environment section just north of Mexican border was by Tijuana effluent. So, as I mentioned before, progress has been made, and I think will continue to be made in the future. Mexico, we just heard. We just received a letter of commitment from the Federal Water Commission in Mexico, saying they want to apply this coming year 35 million gallons specifically to address the Tijuana wastewater issues. That's a huge amount for Mexico, and so that's a very positive sign. And this goes back into sort of why EPA is involved and why the IBWC is involved. I'll just make it short and say EPA is involved because of these binational watersheds. Most of the waters flow, or the majority of waters in the Region 9, which we consider Arizona, Sonora, California, Baja California, actually start in Mexico and flow north in the U.S. You'd be amazed at how many Congress people are mystified by this map. Everyone thinks water flows from north to south, but not always the case. So we have a program that was actually established as a side agreement of Nafta. And this was money that gets allocated, or is money that gets allocated to us each and every year from Congress. And it is specifically to help address these types of transboundary wastewater projects. And so we have invested about $50 million of that money in Tijuana. That's in addition to the $240 million that we invested in the International Wastewater Treatment Plant. And that has provided about 125 miles of sewer connections. And we're currently investing in projects in Mexico. Why this is very important is that it has to be matched by Mexican money if the project's in Mexico, by at least a 1-to-1 match. So it really incentivizes Mexico City to push money towards the border region. It also pays for things like diagnostic study, one of which I have this thing right here, which we'll go to in a heartbeat. And but I wanted to mention some of the solutions here. So this diagnostic study that we just did was to look at, and the reason why you're here probably is to hear about what can be done. We actually looked at solutions on the Mexican side and on the U.S. side to try to curb some of those transboundary flows like you're seeing today. Today is a really good example of something that could be done through improved infrastructure to keep those flows from crossing the border. And we looked at the options on the U.S., we looked at a series of options on the U.S., we looked at a series of options in Mexico. I'm a little worried about time, so I will say that in Mexico, there are certainly a lot of infrastructure improvements that can be made. This was a photo that Gonzalo just sent me about 10 minutes before we started this presentation. But this is a PV silo. This is right at the border. And what you see here is the intake of what should be the intake of that pump, and it's all covered in trash.
This is the silo pump?
This is the PV silo pump, exactly. One of the PV silo. It is a PV silo intake. So what I wanted to show was Mexico has in mind, we met with the new incoming administration that will be starting in November, and they want to actually really upgrade that system and put in a pump that looks like this. Please ignore that. I'm not allowed to lobby for any specific company, but so the idea with this pump is, let me show it to you, is it would essentially shred all of this trash that would come in. And because right now that trash causes big blockages. And then after being shredded, it would be sent to through a screen where all that shredded trash would then be taken back out, and that water could be pumped over the coast into Punta Bandera or into the coast. And so that would keep that system operating much more. Right now, there's about 20 days a year where we have failures in that pump station, predominantly because of the trash problem. Wow, I really like the music here. Let me just keep that going the rest of the presentation. I may have to because I don't know how to stop it. All right.
It's also a problem are those microfibers.
Yeah, I mean, there is no, one thing you learn very quickly in working on sewage issues on the border, there are no perfect solutions. So this is some projects that we are currently working on with EPA financing. The challenge with these projects are, I mean, it shows how expensive, replacement of 6.4 kilometers costs altogether $11 million. And we're funding, U.S. is putting in about $4 million, Mexico's putting in the other $7 million. And the other problem with these is they're not sexy projects. Congress likes to go out there and see a new wastewater treatment plant or, big ribbon cutting. Well, these are projects that are designed to prevent big spills. I mean, they're having a huge benefit, but you don't know that benefit if you've done the project, right? And so they can be very challenging and not always the most attractive to fund. But that's essentially what the key is. So this is the long-term plan. Tijuana has about $330 million of need to really fix this problem. And that includes things like a new wastewater treatment plant that we just saw, but it also includes some reuse projects. So the good news is I do see progress being made to help address those failing infrastructure. The challenge is that there are new water supplies that could be coming online that could actually double the water supply in Tijuana. This is a desal plant that's being proposed. I have two concerns about this plant. One is that obviously, it increases your water supply without having a corollary increase in wastewater treatment plant, but it also is very, very expensive. And so if the state is paying for this, the concern is how are they going to continue to pay for wastewater treatment? So we were just talking earlier about one of the real solutions I think we all see is the wastewater reuse in Tijuana. And this is something that, whether it be through indirect potable reuse or through sending water to the Valle de Guadalupe, which is actually a little bit more expensive because you have to pipe all that water so far south. The Valle de Guadalupe is the wine country of of Baja, but they certainly need the water. The other, I wanted to end on a positive note, but these are two endangered species of birds, and I think Dick could probably speak to this better than I, but apparently in the last, I lost my notes here, but both of these are being showing, despite all these issues that we see here, are actually doing quite well in the estuary, but it really speaks to the importance of having this, not just for public health, but also for environmental health, of making sure this area is as clean as possible. That's all I have. I'm happy to answer some questions. Sure.
The fish in the ocean.
Uh-huh.
How long have you been tracking, the whole program, tracking the fish that are out there? Are we losing more? Are they becoming more toxic or we can't eat them? Where are we at with tracking them out?
Yeah, and I am unfortunately not the person to ask. EPA has not been doing any kind of studies on that. I mean, I know there's a lot of issues with the plastic showing up in fish tissue, and I'm certain that, with all the plastic that's going into the estuary, it can't be a good thing for the fish populations. But the interesting thing though about Tijuana is that you don't see, like you see in other areas of Mexico, like Nogales, for example, where you see very heavy industry, metal platers and all that. In Tijuana, the predominant industry is assembly. not so much manufacturing. So we did tend not to see really high levels of heavy metals, for example, coming through. We see, you know, really the predominant concern is plastics. I would sort of mention bacteria, plastics, and then of course sediment because of protecting of this estuary.
Organic material.
And organic materials, sure, yeah. Especially if that one time, I don't know if I'm sure Dick remembers, the mouth of the estuary closed. Right when all that flow was coming from Tijuana. Well, the minute that mouth of that estuary closed, you can imagine what happened. All that organic material settled there, and you basically created these really nice eutrophic conditions, and you had a huge die-off of, you know, they were recovering all these leopard sharks, and all sorts of things. So they actually had to go there, Fish and Wildlife Service had to go there and bulldoze the mouth of that estuary back open so that that water could get out to the ocean.
You said something about plastics
Yeah.
holding on to toxins, and that's why the sand can't be reused?
That's one of the reasons. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. The state of California has what they call the 80-20 ratio. They have to have a certain 80% sand, 20% fine material, clays, etc., to do beach replenishment. This has much more fines than that. So the idea was, what we did with the study was to determine what would be the effects if would the fines have a big effect, a big negative effect on the environment if we were to apply that along the beaches. And the good news was, no, it really didn't. The sands were fine. But the issue was they did see a little bit peak in bacteria concentrations, which was not surprising. Sand and wet sand and all that likes to retain on bacteria. But what we didn't look at when we did that study was these plastic particles in there. In the back?
So you said that you're trying to increase the water supply and things like that too. So you very slightly mentioned, you know, the wastewater reuse. Is something that you're considering since you had the, when you showed the movie, you had some extra space right at the discharge point, like you said, towards the area where the Trump towers were going to be.
Yeah.
Some extra space there and stuff. Instead of discharging the water out to the ocean, have you considered doing a, natural percolation point with sediment and that creates habitat for those endangered species,
It's a very good, No, it's a very good question, and Mexico has done a lot of studies of looking at even injecting that water around the aquifer, the aquifer that's right around the Rodrigues Dam. We were talking earlier, I mean, you could put a reverse osmosis plant on the end of the treatment plants and discharge that water to the Rodrigues Dam. You have a really good possibility for indirect potable reuse, with the caveat being that I was just told that Rodrigues Dam, which was built in 1920, was obviously not built towards seismic compliance, and so there is that concern that you potentially. But you certainly, there's a lot of opportunities for wastewater reuse. The challenge with wastewater reuse is it's, the most economical is direct or indirect potable reuse. That's typically the hardest to sell to the public. I mean, we saw it in San Diego with toilet to tap. The most expensive is what we call gray water reuse or purple pipe or whatever. And the reason that's so expensive is that you have to build a whole set of redundant conveyance systems. As you saw in Tijuana, there's not a big demand for irrigation of green areas. I mean, there's small little areas. You could do a freeway and all that, but that would require a lot of money to take that water to these small areas. So there is talk as well. There was actually some progress on an Israeli company that wanted to build a pipe to take that water and send it for wine production, for grape production. The economics just right now are not there. The price of water is just too low for what they would have to charge, I think, to make that economically viable. But it's certainly, I think, not that I'm aware of now. The Odis, el proyecto de Odis, no está pasando, ¿no? It's el proyecto de Odis, de Valle de Guadalupe. ¿Lo van a realizar?
Sí. Sí, está buscando un nuevo esquema para no subir el agua a, ¿cómo se llama?
Sandro, bueno, sí.
Y retomarla más abajo.
Okay.
pero seguimos con la idea de poder sacar las aguas negras de la cuenca de Tijuana y tratarlas y mandarlas a Valle de Guadalupe.
So they're looking for another alternative to send it, but it changes every time I talk to them. There's a new plan in mind, and just looking at the economics of it, I don't know how they'll do it, but without some subsidies from, if Mexico were to say, okay, we'll help pay for this by reducing the amount of water that comes to the border, I think that could be an interesting public-private partnership. But I think
había preguntado hace rato si la población o si la gente en Tijuana estaba interesada en dar solución. Quería mencionar que existen organizaciones en México, en Tijuana, como Playa Limpia, Proyecto Fronterizo, Green Angora Verde, que son representaciones de la ciudadanía y que se juntan y que buscan darle solución al problema de saneamiento de Tijuana, sobre todo en la cuenca de Tijuana.
Yeah, Gonzalo was mentioning, in answer to your question about the interest in the Tijuana side, there's actually a lot of NGOs that are very active in looking for solutions, and they meet together. And actually, I find when I go to give one of these talks in Tijuana, I mean, it's capacity. So there is a lot of interest in resolving these issues on the Mexican side of the border as well. I mean, that's this U.S. side solutions that we haven't really gotten into, but they do vary. I was just going to show one of the things we found, and this just go real quick to this study. It's taking it so long. But this was a study that you can access here. But one of the things we found was that what we did was we tried to look at the flows and determine what cost would it be to reduce the days of transboundary flows. And so we came up with different alternatives with different costs, and this would be the number of days of transboundary flows that you would get. And the reason we chose number of days of transboundary flows was almost as a surrogate for beach closures, because we don't know what types of flows have an impact on what beach closures. A very good question. I would love to actually install some type of meter closer to the estuary so that we could see weather flows at the border were reaching the ocean. Right now, the lifeguards go and do a visual observation there. And I think there's technology we could use to try to get a better handle on that. But
the county's working on testing it throughout the estuary.
Yeah.
Throughout the estuary right now.
I don't know why this is my oh well. Anyway, oh, there it is.
Yeah,
all right.
Part of the whole Tijuana. Yeah, question.
So I don't want to get into too much detail. This is all in this study, but this kind of gives you an example of costs. These are the Mexican side alternatives, and what Mexico is currently spending just to pipe that water up out of the river, about $2.7 million a year. If we were to basically put in some help fix those pumps, basically keep it at the same capacity, that would cost about $16 million, but just rehabilitate that system. And Mexico really should be spending about $4.35 million a year to actually keep those flows from entering the United States. And then we looked at maybe expanding that system a little bit in Mexico. Obviously, those costs increased. We looked at really expanding that system in Mexico, and we're getting to the point of kind of absurdity, but then we did the same exercise on the U.S. side, and these are the kind of numbers that we're seeing. And so again, these are not going to solve the Tijuana River problem, but they certainly would reduce the number of days of transboundary flows. Okay, wait, since you had, yeah.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the plastic diversion barrier that was set up in that one picture, and if you could sort of say where that is, and you said it was 30 times bigger for the main channel.
Right.
Is there a lot of plastics flowing in the main channel? Is it just going out to the ocean? What happens to it?
No, you can, let me see if I can go back real quick to that video. You can, here's the video. A lot of it does get trapped in the and we don't have to answer your question quite frankly, we don't know how much of that plastic ultimately makes it through to the ocean. A lot of it does get trapped and buried with sediment. I've been on many beach cleanup, or not cleanup, but estuary cleanups where you will literally, you could spend all day in just 1 square meter digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And what you do find as well is that those little plastic pieces, the older they are, the more fragile they are, and the more likely they are to break. And certainly the cases with styrofoam. That's another thing I think would be a really interesting research question, is to do some actual monitoring in the estuary to look at plastics, especially following a storm, and try to get an assessment. There was a study done that indicated there were about 10 million, an estimate, and this was a few years ago, about 10 million plastic bottles within the estuary itself on the U.S. side. So to answer your question about where things are, let me see if I can get a better. So this is where the Goat Canyon sediment basins are, right here. So it's about 2 miles west of the main channel, and this is where right here is where they built that that trash boom.
Okay, so it's very small.
It was never, that was an add-on to the system. They weren't building this to manage trash. They were building it to capture sediment, and it was really a brilliant idea on their behalf to put in this thing, and it actually turned to be quite effective. So, whether it's something that could be effective on the U.S. side of the main channel, I don't know. There has been some studies done by the IBWC of looking at building a sediment base on the U.S. side, and not surprisingly, what they found is that would not be effective at all, because essentially the main channel is a sediment basin. It's a flood channel, so it's already capturing about 80% of the sediment that's coming across. So building a sediment basin within essentially a sediment basin doesn't make a lot of sense. And because people see this as being a very effective solution for this small channel. So
well, that channel's coming directly out of the population dense area just on the other side, and so then you're going to have a lot of trash coming through. But is there as much trash in the main channel, do you think?
There's certainly as much. Now, you're right about per square area, per square meter of land, probably not. Because you have, the main channel, you have a lot more people with trash services, that sort of thing. Right. But from just a pure quantity, oh yeah, it's mind-blowing when you see after a storm event how much trash has come across the main channel.
Can you comment on the recent activities by elected officials? I saw a lot of activities by some of the Board of Supervisors, Mayor of San Diego, et cetera, what they've been doing.
All I can say is there has been obviously some litigation. A few parties, City of San Diego, Surfrider, Imperial Beach, Port of San Diego, I don't know if I already said Surfrider, Chula Vista have all sued the International Boundary Water Commission. September 13th, the judge has asked them to put together or to submit proposals on what they want to see as a solution. So that's all I can say from that. There are a lot of, Congress has proposed, certain Congress people, Vargas, Peters, have proposed increase of funding for our program, for example. We, in the congressional budget, I think we're at $30 million versus 15 of last year. And we've gone down, to 5 in the past, and so there's a lot of attention. I can't speak too specifically. I know the county's also putting together their own plan. They're actually they're taking sort of using our diagnostic as a start, but looking at really managing much greater flows. Ours was really only designed to handle to look at dry weather flows and maybe curve the tail end of some wet weather events. They're actually looking at putting up a system that would handle 100 million gallons a day, for example, and of essentially storm water. And so that's kind of the extent of what I can speak to on that end. But there's certainly a lot of attention on this area.
How does your proposal on Surfriders and the counties, how are you guys speaking, or how much are you speaking based off of the litigation?
We are not, we can't really speak at all to the litigation. It's been kind of challenging because, we'd like to be, I think, a little, we'd like to sort of reach out more, but because of we're still part of the federal government, so we have to be, we can't sort of discuss as much as we'd like to. So I'm very curious to see what proposals they will come forward with, and to see, and we don't, we're not, I personally don't have sort of a dog in the fight, so to speak. I mean, I'd have to be, obviously, I think cost effectively, it's always better to invest in Mexico, but.
How would a ruling impact the EPA and that
I think it remains to be seen. I mean, the ruling, it still doesn't, ultimately it's up to Congress to decide if they want to fund a big project on the U.S. side, or even to continue to fund our program. That's going to be ultimately a congressional decision. I've seen cases that get decided for the plaintiffs on this, these types of binational issues, but the funding never comes forward, and so it's a Pyrrhic kind of victory.
There's so much trash. I mean, do they have recycling programs and trash pickups that would help him? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't do that ourselves.
No, I don't know, but I mean, it's
Yes, they
every
have recycling.
Oh, they do have.
Oh, yeah, they recycle.
There's so much of MSNBC, they environmental law as a commercial. It's Colossians, something they hand pick stuff up all over the world. And they're coordinated through the internet and they're advertising on MSNBC.
Yeah, you will not find an aluminum bottle or a glass bottle anywhere in that estuary. You will find, I mean, the challenge is there is no, plastic's a tough one. Plastic is a tough one throughout the world in terms of, and were it not for the bottle bill in California, we would probably have the exact same problem they have here there in Tijuana. But
grab a Coke from a taco stand and try and walk away. Ain't gonna happen.
Okay, one more question from me.
Oh, and there's one in the back.
Oh, you got one in the back? Go ahead.
Just.
But just the word to the wise on the plastics is 10 to 15 years ago, nobody knew that all our plastic was going to dissolve into little bite-sized parts for fish. So if you use that, that accelerator you were just showing, it's going to put it into a position where all the fish are going to plastics. So that's not necessarily the answer. But the fact is each and every one of us dragged ourselves into this position by drinking Coca-Cola, Sprite, all those things. But I think we have one thing we can do, and that's get rid of all plastics. And all you do is pull it in by hand all over all over the world, like these people are doing. And then they're just by hand they're picking up stuff. You see it pick up. It's the way we can deal with it. Once all that plastic's out, then we can go back to this idea of slurry.
We actually, Seminat, our equivalent in Mexico, actually funded, they had this program where they would pay, they call it the temporary employment program, and they would pay local residents to go out. We actually, we didn't have any really good metrics, but the state of California said they actually did see during those years less plastic flowing across. And it was, really, really cheap compared to trying to dispose of this stuff on the U.S. side. So I do think there are some solutions in terms of, that's the advantage of cheap labor in Mexico is that you should be able to get some of these programs in place to really help address this. In the back, and then it goes on.
Yes, I'd like to understand. Before I read, the U.S. side used to treat more of the sewer, more quantity, of the sewer of Mexico, and they didn't reduce it. Why?
No, we've always treated 25 million gallons a day. That's been since that plant was built. There's never been a change to that. There's actually a treaty minute that requires 25 MGD, and there's a permit that requires no more than 25 MGD on average. And so there has not been fluctuations on that. The percentage-wise, that's probably the case because the amount of wastewater has grown quite a bit. And so if you have an article, I'll be happy to read it. But I know we've been very, for a long time involved in this. And you had a question. Oh, sorry, Gonzalo.
Luke, son dos problemas diferentes. Calidad de agua, como agua en sí, y la basura, ¿cómo le llaman ustedes? Trash. Pero conjuntan ambos en uno solo, que es la contaminación al mar. Son dos atendientes que se dan, uno por 6, el agua, y el otro por el ayuntamiento.
Es cierto. But let me just translate. So Gonzalo is saying that the wastewater issue is really under their control. They're at the state level. The trash issue, and this is one of the big challenges we have, is the trash issue is actually dealt with at the city level. And so they're the ones who actually have to deal with all the picking up of the trash.
Y escucho sobre las empresas de Coca-Cola, los productos que tienen terminan como basura en plástico, y con respecto a eso, muchas de nuestras acciones en México se financian a través de EPA. EPA tiene un recurso que se lo entrega el Congreso, pero este recurso que obtiene el Congreso, no sé si sale de las empresas como Coca-Cola o alguna otra, y que va directamente a un fondo de EPA para financiar la solución de la calidad de aire o de agua en los países donde se instalan estas maquiladoras como una política pública. ¿Es así como se maneja el recurso?
No. He was asking if Coca-Cola has some program where they actually give money for. I mean, they do have foundation. They do have a foundation. They give very small. I know in Peru, for example, they gave very small. And we actually have some trash. We have a trash-free waters program. And we also have the NOAA marine debris program. And they are working to try to get more involvement from Coca-Cola, but typically they're very small amounts they fund for, but not nothing compared to the amount of the size, the magnitude of the problem. So.
Pusiste un gráfico de recursos invertidos en México para el tema de calidad de agua.
Sí.
Y en una primera parte se maneja unos montos de inversión.
Sí.
No alcanzo a ver el año. Desde 1996 al 2002 hubo un programa que fue Tijuana Sana 1. Del 2003 al 2007 Tijuana Sana 2. 2008 al 2011 crédito 300 del Coronata. Del 2013 en adelante ya fue puro recurso de México nacional, con algunas participaciones del BID.
Yeah, it was just Gonzalo was just commenting about how we used to have when we had a lot of money, we actually had really big projects in Tijuana. We were seeing really huge advancements in quality of improvements, and since the water went down, and this is only U.S. investment. Tijuana continues to invest, but the amount of match that comes from the U.S. has decreased quite a bit. And again, I think the real benefit of us is not only do we get to do we incentivize investment in Mexico, but we also have a seat at the table. We can make sure that Mexico has adequate pretreatment program, that they have resources for O&M and things like that. And the less money we have to invest, obviously, the less voice we have in decisions that get made in Tijuana.
Can I ask a question about this slide?
Sure.
You mentioned that this money was from the Nafta. And then what is the impact of the changes in Nafta and this MCA? USMCA.
So Congress, and I don't want to speak for Congress, but that was the very specific question they brought to us when we met with them was, what could be done to improve both labor and environmental issues, and I can't, it's not my area, but to opine upon, but that's something they are currently looking at. Right now, USMCA is waiting for the Congress to authorize it, and so I think it's, I don't want to say anything more about what sort of leverage they have, but I think they're certainly, this kind of program. I know right now it's not being mentioned as it was. This was, again, to really this was to get the labor unions to sign off on Nafta, was the creation of this program. That
As far as
was,
funding, I don't think it decreases, but I know Surfrider was lobbying to have them increase the budget for border area
Yeah.
projects.
no, we have, I mean, the community's been really outspoken about and writing letters to my boss as well as to congressionals. Senator Feinstein's been a big advocate of our program, and so I can't speak more about it.
Is this the main funding right here?
It is.
Okay, so I think we've gone maybe long enough.
Sure.
It's been an
Yeah,
hour.
I'm happy to answer your questions afterwards.